and welcome to the crash course on Tisha B'Av and the 9 days, the saddest period in the Jewish calendar. On the 9th day of the Jewish month of, in Hebrew Tisha means 9, the Jewish people suffered through some of their greatest calamities. On the 9th day of the first temple of Jerusalem, which was built by King Solomon and stood for 410 years, was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple of Jerusalem, which is built on the exact same spot as the first, and which stood for 420 years, was laid waste by the Romans. The Bar Kokhba revolt, in which the Jewish people rebelled against the Roman conquerors 65 years later, was brutally crushed with the loss of over 500,000 lives. And on the 9th day of Av, the Temple Mount was plowed over, and the holy city of Jerusalem was turned into a pagan city. What made the 9th day of Av a magnet for such tragedies? It was an event that occurred 480 years before the Jews even had a temple in Jerusalem. While the Jewish people were still in the desert, they listened to the slander of 10 spies that were sent out to scout out the land. Instead of encouraging the final step in a long journey that began in the land of Egypt and was supposed to conclude in the land of Israel, the spies painted a picture of the land of Israel that ruined the Jewish people's resolve to enter the promised land. They called it a land that consumes its inhabitants, that promised to be no more than a national graveyard. The Jewish people cried all night, and with those tears severely damaged their connection to the land of Israel. And therefore God said, because they cried for nothing on that date, which was the 9th day of Av, in the future they would have real reason to cry. And it's been with our tears throughout the generations that we've been working to reestablish our connection to the land of Israel, to see its centrality within the national identity, and to realize it's the only place to realize our true potential in our relationship with God. The rabbis decreed that 3 weeks before the 9th of Av, the Jewish people should begin the mourning process. That begins on the 17th day of the Jewish month Tammuz, which is the anniversary when the Romans broke through the walls of Jerusalem. Then on Rosh Chodesh Av, the first day of the Jewish month Av, we intensify the mourning. But what exactly are we mourning? The Temple of Jerusalem represented the zenith of the Jewish people's potential. It was a house of God that we built not just from mere stones, but from a deep desire to have God's presence in our midst on His terms. Built on the same spot that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac on, it enabled every Jew to experience their own intense relationship with God. It increased their commitment to live by the standards of God's treasured nation. And it also helped spiritually heal all those who had previously faltered. The nations of the world ascended to Jerusalem to experience God's presence in the midst of His people and listen in awe to the words of His Torah. So how destructive can it be when we give that all up for false gods and idolatry? How devastating is it to us personally when we no longer aspire to be a light unto nations, but just want to be like all the other nations? And how long will the Almighty want to reside in a home where we bring offerings with an empty heart and observe our traditions simply out of routine? And so it began in the recesses of our heart, eventually snowballed into horrible transgressions. The Talmud teaches that the first temple was ultimately destroyed because of murder, idolatry, and illicit relations. And the second temple crumbled because senseless hatred for one another became the norm. Thankfully, our tradition teaches that just as we were the cause for the temple's destruction, so can we be the source for the rebuilding. The key is to mourn for the loss, to feel the pain of the Jewish people no longer unified, no longer anchored with a spiritual home, and more important, with a vast majority of Jews who no longer are aware of their intended status amongst the nations. So what are the various practices for mourning? In general, the Jewish approach to mourning is to refrain from material comfort so that we can get in touch with the spiritual loss. And therefore, for the 9 days, we don't eat any meat or drink wine, except on the Sabbath. We don't cut our hair, shave, or bathe for pleasure, just as mourners are prohibited from doing so. We don't travel for leisure or wear freshly laundered clothing. Tradition teaches as the month of Av enters, we diminish our joy. In the late afternoon before Tisha B'Av begins, we have a special meal consisting of bread and an egg. An egg is the traditional mourner's food. Its round shape represents a cycle of life, and the fact that it has no mouth or opening signifies that there are times in life when we must accept difficult situations and remain silent. Tisha B'Av itself is a full day fast that is observed in the same way we observe Yom Kippur. No eating, drinking, washing, wearing leather shoes, or intimacy. On the night of Tisha B'Av, we read the book of Lamentations, a prophetic work written by the prophet Jeremiah that foretells the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Jeremiah tried to warn the Jewish people again and again and again to change their ways, but they wouldn't listen. During the day, we read from a collection of liturgy called Kinot. Each poem expresses a different facet of the sadness, the loss, and destruction we brought upon ourselves. The custom is also to sit in low chairs until midday as a sign of humility, and we also limit our business activities. And finally, we refrain from studying the Torah except for those sections that deal with the destruction and mourning, because typically Torah study is a source of joy. I'd like to conclude the crash course with one thought. The Book of Lamentations in Hebrew is called Eicha, which means, how could it be? But tradition teaches that the same letters can be pronounced differently, in the same way that God addressed Adam after Adam disobeyed God and ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Ayaka, where are you? Where are you now, Adam, that you violated my trust and followed your passions? And that's a question we have to keep asking ourselves again and again on Tisha B'Av. Where are we? Are we really any better off when we're not gathered around the Sabbath table every week with our family and friends, sharing insights into life and observing our own rich tradition? Are we any better off choosing many of today's role models that fail in the basics of integrity and trust, instead of focusing on our greatest ancestors that combine wisdom and moral courage to impact the world? Are we really better off looking at what makes us different from one another in the way we look, behave, or live, instead of reaching out and admiring the fact that we all come from the same family, the same home, and are meant to work together to be a light unto nations? And will we ever be successful if we keep God out of our own lives and out of our own national identity? May this year be the last time we mourn for all the great losses and tragedies. Instead, let this Tisha B'Av be the day we rededicate ourselves to rebuilding a home for the Almighty in our midst, based on the heart and soul and the good deeds of His treasured people, next year in Jerusalem.